Okay, the story we're telling you, friends. Good morning, Ronnie, who joined especially early to hear the story.
Good morning, Rabbi. Good morning, friends.
So this story, Ronnie, can you see? Because it's a bit visual. It helps to be visual. This is a story that's related.
I'm actually on a walk.
On a walk. All right. Okay. So Gekas of the Hate. So I'll just tell you, but those that can see the fellow on here. So this story is related, Rabbi Agoin, Rabbi Moishe Weiss, the father of Benjamin, Jonas and Benjamin Weiss in Montreal, the Rosh of Bezdin. All of his children are all Rosh Hashivas and Rosh Bati Dinim in various places throughout the world, London and other places. And he tells the following story. And the story so far is this. He's telling how he was in Auschwitz. And he described the Kloisenberger Rebbe in Auschwitz, who later becomes his mechuten. The children marry. And how he was a source of comfort and inspiration for others. And how on the one hand, he was obviously part of Auschwitz. He faced death daily because he wouldn't eat today. On the other hand, he was completely in a higher world, and he described his Shabbos and the Shalashudas. He wrapped himself in the striped Auschwitz. Can we call them clothes? What can we call them? And he would say Torah and Shalashudas. Then he described how, towards the end of the war, just began describing how the Nazis stepped up the destruction of Jewry, intensified it after Russia began. And they were seeing defeat. And Russia began the great offensive. And already captured Ukraine. And that's when Hungarian Jewry was, Auschwitz was working around the clock, 10,000 Yidden, 10,000 of fascists. Murdered daily. 2 million lost their lives there. So this is now to the end. So he together turns out with the Kloisenberger Rebbe. So there was a selection, and they were taken. Hi, you're welcome to stay, but the Shacharit is downstairs. Yes.
Thank you.
Starting soon. So they was a selection, and they were sent in cattle cars to Warsaw to clear the rubble. It describes there how the water was dripping through. 3 days they weren't given food or drink. It was raining and water was dripping through the cracks of the cattle car, and somehow there was these tin cups, and one fellow is able to gather it, and he gives the Rebbe his water, and he promptly uses it to wash until Yadayim. Didn't drink it. They were parched, thirsty. So then, after Warsaw, they were taken to Dachau, and there were another selection, and they were taken to a place called Mildorf, which I looked up and I told you a little bit about it in Wikipedia. And this was a huge slave camp. And part of what they were doing, they're probably familiar, they were building underground tunnels to build the Messerschmitts underground, protected from the Allied bombing. It's insane policies, and how many died doing this. So this was backbreaking work until, which we're up to now, on the 17th of year, 1945, in the Waldlag of Miltov, I'm translating now, they waited a day of freedom. And that day, the Nazis, they were insane. They were, not to tell you, but there was also an insanity towards the end of the. So they were shutting them back and forth in the cattle car, back and forth. And finally it stops. Somewhere near a town called Tunzig, which is near Munich. And all of a sudden, it's quiet outside. The Germans ran away, and we're looking through the cracks in the cattle car, and we see American soldiers. Day of Liberation, 17th of year, 1945. he says that the Kloisenberger Rebbe had lost in the Holocaust his wife. She was the daughter of the Baal Atzei Chaim and all his 10 children. Despite that, like a lion, he rose, a survivor among survivors. I mean, skin and bone, and ill. And with great determination, he took the staff of leadership in his hand, and he began to lead and inspire and look after the needs of the survivors. He said, I'm not going to review now, says Rabbi Moishe who passed away last year. Again, that's him here. I'm not going to, 2 years ago, I'm not going to review the whole story. This is recorded in the Tzanz, the descendant of Chaim Tzanz at Kloisenberg, in the Tzanz history. But I want to tell you, he says, is this following story. The first thing that burned in the bones, he says, of the Rebbe, of the Kloisenberger Rebbe, was to bring to burial the Jews. He says, in those when we were going back and forth on the train before liberation around the area of Tunsing, the Rebbe saw bodies and bodies littering the sides of the tracks, and many of them were Jews and people that we knew from Mildov, which was the labor camp that where we worked. So now, the Rebbe is organizing, and he approaches the head of the camp, the Americans, and he wants help to gather the bodies. He says the pen is too poor to describe what this required. After all of these years under Nazi rule, and the physical strength so that's what happened. So in Tunsing, there was a non-Jewish cemetery. So aided by the American soldiers, the officer was able to get his area next to the non-Jewish cemetery. He told us, the Rebbe, have to make it 4 cubits away, and we made a fence, and so a Beis HaChayim was established there in Tunsing for the Kadoshim of the Holocaust. The Rebbe himself organized amongst the survivors 5 or 6 young fellas. I was one of them. We had some koyach. The Eibishter gave us koyach, and we went to find bodies. He said, many days, overseen by the Rebbe himself, that also participated. He worked in it, in the purification of the bodies, given a tahara, and he made sure that a kaddish was said for each one. So I cannot tell you how difficult this was physically and spiritually. We were crushed and broken, including the Rebbe. And as a result of dealing with the bodies, we contracted typhus. And seeing the bodies, many of them in the state of decay, and it was a sight that no eye should see. End of story. Now, many years passed, and I'm trying to forget these visions of those terrible days. 20 years later, this is 1965. I can't tell you why. He's saying, I'm starting to think about those days. And they're like, I'm obsessed with it. And I'm seeing the bodies, he describes here pieces of flesh, bone, half bodies. And then the following occurred. This is around 1965, 40 years ago. My wife and I, they lived in Eretz Yisrael, in Bnei Brak. So my wife and I visited London. Now that time, one of our acquaintances told us about a Jew living in London. His name is Avram Yitzchak Glick, is his name. And here is a picture of him in the center there. Avram Yitzchak Glick, who lived in London. And they were telling me he was a community activist and a very special person. Now my wife's maiden name is Glick. And I heard the name, so I asked, so where does he come from? I find out He's from Vienna, and I knew, because in Vienna before the war, it was a city full of Chachomim and Seifrim, and many of them came from Galicia. My wife, his name is Glick, also from Galicia. So I wanted to find out, maybe they're related, my wife, to this Avram Yitzchak Glick. So I made a connection, having heard about him through an acquaintance, to meet him. So we meet him, exchanging information. It turns out that there's no family connection. Now this Rabbi Glick, this 1965, received us very warmly, and we had a lengthy conversation. And in the course of the conversation, it was fascinating. This Rabbi Glick mentioned the Lubavitcher Rebbe several times in speaking about him with great awe and respect, great admiration. So I said to him, maybe tell me a story. I see that you have a connection. Tell me an episode that with the Rebbe that for which I can see you have such admiration. So he says, all right, I'll tell you a story that happened 2 years ago. 2 years ago. One day, okay, this will be the today's shir. It's worth it. One day I get a telephone call from the Rebbe's secretariat. On the other end of the line is Rabbi Chadakov, who says in the Rebbe's name, the Rebbe wants to commission you on a particular shlichus and mission. The Rebbe has said, Rabbi Chadakov, the Rebbe's secretary conveys, the head of the secretarial staff, the Rebbe asked me to convey, this is very unusual, that if you will do so, the Rebbe shows you a place in Olam Haba. So I wanted to hear, so what's the shlichus? And he started to tell me. These are the words of Rabbi Chadakov conveying the Rebbe's words. In a small town near Germany, and the Rebbe said the name of the town, not far from Munich, there is a small cemetery, which the Kedoshim Netahirim that were murdered in the Holocaust by the Nazi Yimach Shemam are buried. Now, because of the situation at that time, they were buried next to the non-Jewish cemetery with a division, as is the halacha. With time, the non-Jewish cemetery expanded, and so the situation currently is that it surrounds the Jewish cemetery, and moreover, the mechitza, the wall that was built around the Jewish cemetery, the Kedoshim, has fallen. And so they're now in an open space. Please go there immediately, continues the secretary Rabbi Chadakov, and make connections with the proper authorities and see to it that there should be a proper fence all around this small cemetery. Rabbi Chadakov did not wait for my response and starts to give me instructions how to build the fence. For example, it has to be made with cement and should be no less than 2 meters high. The Rebbe also asked that when you finish it successfully, take pictures from all sides and send the pictures to the Rebbe to 770. Now, Rabbi Glick continues to Rabbi Weiss. He says, I'd already, as you can, at that time, this is 2 years ago, this is 1963. He says, at that time, I'd already heard about the Rebbe, but I was not a Chabadnik. He became eventually a Chabadnik and became known as the roving ambassador of the Rebbe. He was a big businessman, and he had connections with government, especially in Spain, Germany, and did extraordinary things. A book maybe should be written about this, Rabbi Glick. But this is the early days. So I asked Rabbi Chadakov, why is the Rebbe asking me to do this? This is the first time he's ever gotten such a shlichus, and this was the beginning of him becoming a chassid. And Rabbi Chadakov says it appears that because you speak German well, and you have broad connection with government agencies there, later it's in brackets, he became known as the roving ambassador of the Rebbe. Therefore, we're asking you. Okay, so after getting such an assurance, I did what was asked. I went to Germany, identified the place, and I made the fence around it exactly according to the instructions, to photographs, and sent the pictures back to 770. Sometime later, short time later, I get a telegram. The Rebbe acknowledges receipt of the letter and the pictures and mentions that he will keep his promise. This is most unusual. about the world to come. That's the story of Rabbi Glick that he tells Rabbi Weiss, tell me an episode. Rabbi Weiss is listening to this, and I sat frozen to my place. I couldn't move. It's just at this time I was thinking about these Kedoshim, what I'd gone through, and I'm hearing this story. This is like unbelievable. And Rabbi Glick sees this is on my face. I'm turning white. So he says, "Am I feeling okay?" He gives me a little bit of, vodka at the table. Drink something. And finally, I'm able to speak. I said, "What's the name of that small town? You just said it was a small town. What was the name of that town?" So Rabbi Glick thinks a moment. He says, "Tunzik." He says, "Now I was on the verge of literally fainting." And he took me to he ran to the kitchen and he got me and he washed my face. Rabbi Weiss concludes, it's Rabbi Weiss, the father of the Weiss, Rabbi Weiss here. He said, I knew many of the people that were buried in Tunzik. Not one of them was a Lubavitcher Chassid. They were mainly Hungarian Jews. But the Lubavitcher Rebbe sits in Brooklyn, cannot sit at peace in his room, knowing that in a small town in Germany, they're being swallowed up by the non-Jewish, by the Gentile basic cemetery. And he says, I then subsequent hearing the story, the Kloisenberger Rebbe says, I then inquired of the Rebbe himself, no one. The Rebbe never told anybody and not communicated with the Rebbe. And there was no communication. And it's only concludes, these Kedoshim Mitahirim, these Neshamas came in the words of Rabbi Moishe to the Tzaddik Hador and said to him, Rebbe, do us a favor. And the Rebbe dispatched me to take care of matters. Okay, friends.